We all appreciate the time that you have taken to be with us here tonight and to impart your thoughts on a very relevant topic is the Black Church losing its grip. But before delving into our discussion, I would like to introduce our guest moderator, Hazel Trice Edney. Thank you. So great to be here, and I look forward to an exciting, a lively, and a powerful discussion. And my aim is always to come to some kind of resolution. To not just talk about the problems, to not just talk about the issues, but to talk about where we go from here. And each one of us, I believe, have answers within us. And I'm just really excited to present to you and introduce to some this distinguished panel. Amen. Yes. Give God praise. Yes. Well, this distinguished panel. And as I said, I'm excited to be here. So we're just going to roll right, into it. I left out intentionally a part of my bio because I just wanted to tell you this just to make it clear. First, I just thank Derek Kinney for having invited me, and I pay my respects to Denise Roloff Barnes, an NPA publisher who is going to be moderating. It's going to be emceeing tomorrow night at the launch of my wire service. I have great respect for her and the work that she's doing at the Washington Informer. So we were somewhere else just this morning or yesterday morning. You're just all over the place. So she's just so active in the community, and we need people active in the community. But the part of my bio that I left out is the fact that I served as a deaconess and am a minister in training at Dominion Church of Washington, D.C. For the last 5 years, I've served as intercessory prayer leader and an altar counselor there. Well, what had happened was, about 10 years ago, when I first came to Dominion Church, I began to mentor a young lady. Fast forward, I was mentoring her in holiness when I found out that she was having sex with our pastor. Come on, let's be real. I'm just going to go right to the elephant, that's here. We're going there first. And 2 years later, he had to leave the church, and he and his wife divorced, and it was a big mess. And fast forward 5 years later, from the time he left, I am now probably the #1 advocate for his return as pastor. And the reason is what I believe this panel knows about, and that is what I believe to be the healing power of God. So I just want to go ahead and put that out there, because I'm in a fight over that, and I'm fighting many people, and then there are many people who are with me on that. So, kind of like fast forward, we've seen what happened with the, we can just name them: Eddie Long, Paul Shepard. What's the pastor in Baltimore? Maybe we ought not call his name because it never did hit the paper. And so I guess the question I would want to start off tonight, there's some questions, but I'll just kind of take from here. The expectations of our leaders. Are they realistic? Or are we setting our leaders up for failure by allowing an abuse of power? Anybody who wants to just jump right on in?
You got to start.
Okay. Well, first of all, I am honored to be here as a part of this discussion. And I know it's ordained by God for me to try to share some thoughts this evening. I knew it not just when Derek asked, but when I found out it was going to be in this building. Dorothy Heights, one of my mentors. I worked in this building. I helped identify this building as a place that ultimately became the home of the National Council of Negro Women. And so just being in the Dorothy I. Height building gives me a little power tonight to say some things that in my flesh I might not say. but in the spirit I will attempt to share. The title for the panel tonight is The Black Church Losing Its Grip. It's the setup for this question. And I would first offer that once we decide what the definition of church is for us, then you can decide what your answer to that question is. From where I sit, the answer is no, it's not losing its grip, but we just have to understand what the expectations of the church should be. And we define the church so differently. Some of us really only think of it as a place to go to. Others of us recognize that the church is something to be. We are to represent the kingdom. And so in that context, when we ask this question about our leaders and expectations of our leaders, our expectations have to start of ourselves. In the faith tradition that I represent, which is the Christian faith tradition, to be Christ-like reminds us that we don't judge others, that we operate from a position of love and forgiveness, that all of us have fallen short, and that even if you look at the examples in Scripture, and I'll just go to David, some of y'all may not be Sunday school students, but a man who did some of everything, God was still able to use. And so when we look at our humanness and know that we cannot be perfect, that there are going to be flaws, I think where the problem lies for me is that sometimes we just don't name what the problem is. We don't call people to account after something's happened. You just stepped into poo-poo, we just let you keep on going. We don't stop and say, we need to look at what's happened and how can we help you and how do we do the reconciliation piece that we're called to do. And so we do have a responsibility to hold leaders accountable. We don't have the responsibility to just judge, point our fingers at what everybody else does, break the church down, run away. But sometimes it takes a moment of healing. And that moment could be 5 years. That moment could be longer than that. But when we look at our own lives and say, what would I do? I have a little example that might not seem relevant, but I want to go ahead and share it because I was thinking about this on the way over here, of how judgmental I can be sometimes without even realizing it. And I'm hurting myself. I had a doctor who I stopped going to. Not because she wasn't a good doctor, she didn't give me any bad advice. I'm almost embarrassed to tell you, but she gained a whole lot of weight. And I thought, now how can she teach me how to be healthy if she doesn't look healthy to me? Whether that's valid or not, I had to chastise myself for that judgment. Everything she'd done for me had helped me. And yet I left her. Did the same thing with a hairdresser. Because her hair never looked good. But I was letting her deal with my hair. And so if we take it out of that supernatural, high spiritual, holier than thou realm, and look at a practical way, we do have to reconsider the context of how we examine other people's lives, whether they're spiritual leaders or not. None of us are perfect. The Bible requires us, which is our base, and there are 3 books I'm going to point to you all to tonight, and the Bible's the first, requires us to use love as the grounds from which we operate. And since this is about the church, I think I can say that and be on safe grounds. And then to recognize that nobody except Jesus Christ is perfect. We're all going to sin, and we're going to fall, we're going to get back up again. But in that, what do we learn? And how do we show other people that they don't have to be perfect to come to the throne? So we're not losing our grip. We just have to examine our expectations, look at our own lives, and seek to be transformed, to become better. And if somebody else becomes better because somebody else failed, then that's still a part of that process of becoming who we're called to be because of who God is.
Okay, I would just want to, you can still answer that same question, Reverend Wamble, but just to move a little bit more into it, I interviewed Bishop Jakes a few years ago on this exact topic because what had happened in my church. And so journalistically, I had to just get a grip on it by writing about it.
And this is what he said to me. He said a lot of clergy feel like it's a disgrace to the cross to get counseling. When they feel themselves going in a certain direction because of whatever, not any excuses, but maybe because of fatigue, psychological, unaddressed issues, etc., they don't get help because they themselves fear of being judged. Speak to that, as well as the expectations of our leaders and whether they're too high.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I think that expectations for leaders should be high, and that's why they're leaders. That's why, hopefully, they have been called into the position that they are in, and that they didn't ascend there by false pretenses. So I believe that the expectations should be high, but I also believe that everyone should understand that they are still human. And they, when you get up that high, there are greater temptations, there are greater problems that you face. And so, as a people, I believe that as we look up to our leaders, that we need to also support them. And when we talk about our church leaders, we need to definitely pray for them. And if need be, we need to criticize them. We always need the same balances that we need, because there is there's so many battles that are going on. And as a spiritual leader, one who is called to shepherd a flock, there are different things that are going on, and you have to be able to withstand the challenges both internally and externally. And when you get to a position that you feel you are too great or too high to fall down, then once you find yourself on the ground, then you will figure out that you are not. And it is that pedestal that puts you in a position that maybe you feel that you do not need counseling. But then it also depends on the people that you have around you. I am blessed. I have known my wife our entire life, and she keeps me grounded. For those who know her. and so as those challenges come, and as a pastor, and you preach a dynamic message, and you have everyone coming and telling you how great you are and how great the message was, and you get all these accolades and things, and now I'm trying to get out the door, but my head is too big.
Right.
My wife comes with a big pen, and she pops it and she brings me down to earth. And you need people like that around you as leaders. You need a support system of people who will keep you grounded. And you need a support system that may tell you you need some help. And there are challenges there that are beyond you. It's a whole thing. I know that we're going to talk later on. And this whole thing of power. When you start to get a lot of power, the corruption seeps in. When you get a lot of money, corruption seeps in. In the Bible, there are so many verses that talk about money and the love of money, the root of all evil, how difficult it is for a rich man to get into heaven. I mean, there are all of these challenges that come as you go up in leadership, as you gain in prosperity. As all these things come your way, there are some serious challenges that you have to face. And if you don't have the correct support system around you, and those people who are willing, no matter who you are, and no matter how great you think you are, people who are willing to say, you need to stay, you need to slow down, you need to change, you need to do some other things, then you can get yourself into some serious trouble. And so a lot of preachers, they are lifted up so high that, yeah, they do feel that it's a disgrace. They want to keep counsel on the hush-hush. Or as a minister, God's going to take care of that. All I got to do is pray, and it's going to happen. I'll pray it away. And your prayer may be telling you that you need to go and get some help. But you have to be able to recognize those things that are around you, because there's a lot of warfare that goes around. The higher you go, the higher the level of warfare that you have to face.
So let's look at the Black Church on Sunday morning. I have this book. It's called Pimpin' from the Pulpit to the Pews. Has anybody ever seen this book? Pimpin' from the Pulpit to the Pews, exposing and expelling the spirit of lust the church, written by Hassani Pettifer. This is one paragraph here. Churches are full of people in desperate situations, running to the altar in order to receive a touch from the pastor, eagerly anticipating a touch of healing, deliverance, and restoration. Many spiritually hungry souls cry out, asking God to fix them. Change me, Lord. Fix my problems and make it go away. They believe and stand on the word, but don't live the word concerning deliverance. Unfortunately, many saints are guilty of waiting for God to do something for us instead of along with us. What Hassani is saying here is that there are people who become too dependent upon the pastor, too dependent upon the Black church to help to fix them, and thereby they become prey, P-R-E-Y, to pastors who are hurting or pastors who have these problems. Lon Walls. When that happens, and when it hits the news, you and others who have the expertise of being public relations professionals have to fix it. Is that hurting or helping the situation? To put a face on this.
Well, first of all, I'm glad you put that communication spin, because after following them two,
Take it out if you want to.
Yeah, Marvin knows me. So I think, actually, I wanted to kind of follow up with their comments and this kind of because I think, first of all, society that we live in today is so different, so changed by the media and by technology. We wouldn't have this conversation even 5 years ago, 10 years ago. This would not happen. It wouldn't even be a topic of discussion, because you have Facebook, you have Twitter, you have social media, you have the immediacy of the media. You have so many other elements now, and it goes back to this whole issue about leadership. Our leaders, as they are supposed to be conceived as being leaders, need to understand the immediacy of the media. We are in the midst of, even though it's not religious, we're in the midst right now of a crisis, in a county close to this place, that, again, the media has been transporting this throughout the world. And I guess it goes to Bishop Long and his situation, which is still yet to be resolved. And the thing is, you tell clients, first of all, as reporters, they've always told us, if you don't want it, if it's off the record, you don't say it. Okay, that's always been the standard policy, and these days, you're under scrutiny, almost immense scrutiny, to the point where you've got phones, you've got everything you do, everything you say, it's immediate. And I think the problem is that people need to understand, we need to understand that sometimes immediacy is not always accurate, it's not always fair. I think we go back to the situation with the agriculture with Chruch. Chruch is a perfect example where it went wrong real fast. And so we all have to, and leadership has to understand that. We can't rush to judgment. But in that same sense, I think that there needs to be a knowledge of the immediacy of the media and what it can do. And I think that folks like us are called. And I think a lot of times, I said something the other day, we were talking about Prince George's County, and good government speaks for itself. You don't have anything to hide. If you're a minister or pastor or bishop and you're doing the right thing, then there's nothing to hide, there's no problem. And it's interesting that Marvin and I have talked about this reluctance to seek counseling and help. It's not just with leadership. We as a people, we have that problem. We talked about what happened with Katrina, and we talked about the psychological problems that still exist in New Orleans because of the fact of the issues that folks are still suffering. Then you compound that with the Gulf spill. So, there are a lot of things that we as a society need to address. And then hopefully, going back to leadership, our leaders need to be more in tune and more state-of-the-art to understand this, both in terms of how they address their own issues as well as addressing their own congregations and their own constituents.
Following up on what Lon is saying, it's, the Black church oftentimes reminds me of the Black family. You remember, that part where all of a sudden in the conversation, your mother, your grandmother just sort of shut down, and we wouldn't talk about it anymore. Whether you ask who so-and-so's daddy was, or some issue that's long kept secret that they just don't want to talk about. The Black church appears to be that closed. We don't want to air out these issues, but when they pop up again, we continue to act surprised, although we know that they're there. Now, we're transitioning. We can talk about it in the context of the infidelity of pastors or even HIV/AIDS. We don't want to talk about the homosexual or the gay lifestyles right in our own communities. The church, even some right here now, are uncomfortable now. The temperature went down a little bit because we don't want to go there. But the scourge of HIV/AIDS in our community, is it caused by this closed community of the church just not wanting to talk about it?
I love these questions. I think it goes back again to how we define the role of the church. The church is that institution that helps us with our moral compass, the church that helps us recognize a value system, the church that ought to be preaching and teaching messages that are relevant for the times. And so if you just go to HIV/AIDS, if there is particularly in the Black church, we're not monolithic, but if there is a Black church that still is not willing to raise healthcare issues and HIV/AIDS issues and our responsibility to each other, again, thinking of Dr. Height, to see Dr. Height having a session on the mall talking about the sexual behavior of women who are 40 and older, who are now in that category that the HIV/AIDS is going up the highest. And at 97 and 98 years old, being a spokesperson for that, there shouldn't be a pastor in this country that isn't willing to raise the challenges of that issue. That's part of our educational responsibility. And if the ministry is not relevant, if we're preaching and teaching about things that aren't helping to save and change people's lives, then we're not being true to what I believe the gospel calls us to do. You don't keep people alive with dead messages. You keep people alive, give them hope by helping them to see how to work through joblessness, how to work through health issues, how to work through the recession, and giving them hope even in the times when things are bad. I will share that when I've been in Metropolitan 23 years, and about the time I joined Metropolitan, the HIV/AIDS issue was alive. And we had many difficulties deciding how to navigate that issue. And not as a statement of pride, but just a statement of how time has changed. Just last year, the Black AIDS Council gave Metropolitan its Washington, D.C. award for the work that our church is doing to try to help get the message out and encourage people to be tested and to shape our behaviors in such a way that we help lower the incidence. So it's got to be relevant to the times, and it can be uncomfortable, but it's better than having people die. So we have to challenge ourselves to do that. It doesn't make it easy, but it is the church's responsibility to speak to those issues of sexual morality, of safety, and the safety issue around HIV/AIDS has taken precedence for many of us now over whether you care whether somebody's having sex or not. You don't want people to die. And we have to be willing to give people language to talk about that, and as opposed to look like they need their mouths washed out or so. We had a preacher a few Sundays ago who said to us that they started a sexual identity ministry at his church. And he had people get really upset about that. And then one of the 15-year-old boys came up and said, well, I'm glad that we're having this and we're talking about safe sex, because I'm at that age where I'm probably going to do it. And I'd rather know that if I'm going to do it, I'm not going to die from doing it if I follow this set of rules. And so we had people in our congregation that said you could feel, as you said, the temperature change. But you could also feel the positive response when it was shared with us that this young boy felt like getting that message at church was better than getting that from his friends. So it's not easy stuff, but if it was easy, anybody could do it.
Pastor Wamble.
I I think first, and we've touched on it several times, we really need to get a good definition of what church is. Because the church that we grew up with is not the church that we have now.
Absolutely not.
Church has changed drastically. The church, because when you talk about the black church, you always think about in the 60s, and there was the black church, and you can say, who was the head of the black church? And everyone turned to Martin Luther King. There's always someone. But if someone asks you now, who's the head of the black church? Who would you say? And so it's very, very different, and things have changed so drastically in the church itself that we really need to face the facts that it's hard to even say the church. Any church in Washington, D.C., AIDS is going to definitely be the top priority because of the rapid acceleration of AIDS in this city. In another city, it might be homelessness. In another city, it might be in unemployment. There has to be, I know you're social justice, so I know you're all over all this. But churches, no matter where you are, you have to be familiar with where you are. You have to be familiar with what's going on in your state, what's going on in your city, and what's going on with your community. Because if you don't understand what's going on in the community, you can't reach out and help your community. So the church, all of them are going to have different issues. Whether it's AIDS, if I've got to deal with AIDS because it's running rapid around, I've got to deal with that. That's not going to mean if my area is high unemployment, I'm not going to ignore AIDS, but I've got to face the people who are in my congregation and try to help them and give them hope and give them direction on what's happening in that community. Another thing we've got to bring up, and this always gets me in trouble, is mega churches. Because mega churches, as I look at the mega churches, you running this tape, man?
They're supposed to be on the record.
This is my opinion and not the opinion of the United Methodist Church. I said it. Mega churches to me are like Kmart. Because when a mega church comes, most of the time a mega church, there's no room in the city for a mega church. So they move outside to the outer areas of the church, the suburbs. And just like when Kmart goes somewhere, the small businesses all begin to close because everyone's going to Kmart and you're not going to Mr. Phil's barbershop, or you're not going to Mr. Phil's hardware store anymore. And when a mega church comes in, the problem is that most mega churches aren't getting the unchurched. The mega churches are pulling people from some of the other smaller churches because there's so much activity and so much money and so many things that are going on there. It's like, I've got to go there, but you're killing the church that are in the communities who can touch the people who they actually know. Because I tell you, if you have a church of 20,000 people, as a pastor, I don't know 20,000 people. I don't know what's hurting them. I don't know, I have staff. I'm a brilliant organizer, brilliant with logistics. I can't figure that out. But churches in communities know what's going on, and their responsibility is to reach out and touch the people in those communities and help them find Jesus, help them find salvation, but also help them in those issues that they face every single day. Because when you step outside the church, I don't care how saved you are, when you step outside the church and you don't have no job, you have some difficulties right there. And so churches have to be able to really face the realities of those things that are close to them and be able to make a change in lives.
Let's stick right there for 1 second. Is the Black church losing its grip? You mentioned, I think, passingly Dr. King and what was going on back here in the civil rights movement, and how at that time the Black church was reflecting that which America as a nation needed, and that was equality, racial equality, equal justice, etc. We look at the Black church now, and it's so diversified. There's so many different churches, denominations, and what you call the mega churches, etc. But the churches that I know of, we all have our own experience with the church. They are not about reflecting what society is saying, but they're about reflecting what some might call sin sickness. In other words, the preaching of the gospel will answer it all. I just want to hear your take on that. What about just the plain gospel that will address the HIV/AIDS? You won't go out and have sex before marriage, etc. Some people get HIV after they're married, don't get me wrong. But I've heard it in press conferences. I've been a reporter for 25 years, where the pastors actually come together and address crime sin sickness. So you just preach Jesus and everybody will stop killing each other, right?
I was a reporter. That was one part of my bio that wasn't on it. I was a reporter for 20 years and also in public relations for 20 years as well. I understand what you're talking about. But let's face the realities. Let's face the realities of this situation. You can preach all you want, but there's this thing called obedience. And if you aren't obedient to the word that you hear in church on Sunday morning, then you go out of the church and into the world. And most people have been in the world longer than they've been in the church in terms of a dedicated lifestyle. Even once you give your life to Christ, you have been in the world and you fall back on worldly things when things get tough and things get difficult. The Bible is an outstanding guide that tells us the way. But God has also given us gifts that allows us to take this guide and to use it in the community. I was in public relations, so the Lord has trained me to use the skills that I went to school for, that I went to corporate America for, to use those skills in the church to take what is in the Bible and to use it to affect lives. And I think preaching the gospel and preaching it is really good. It's an outstanding beginning, but this thing is a process. It's not stagnant. It doesn't preach the word and everything changes. Preach the word and let's get to work.
Let me, I think one of the things, and Marvin talked about public relations, an issue that we're faced with in terms of, again, what is the black church? The problem we have is that, again, we're so diversified now. It's not just the church. You look at the quote-unquote civil rights organizations today, the organizations, we're fragmented. At one point in time it was the NAACP. It's not just the NAACP anymore. You have the urban, you have a lot of different organizations, and we're fragmented in terms of our needs and our desires. And so with the black church, the unfortunate piece is where with the civil rights movement, because of the publicity, you knew who was what. The black church is different, and unfortunately now, especially the black church is now being scrutinized by the mainstream media, by everybody else. And unfortunately, it's a situation like with Bishop Eddie Long, where the first lens that some people have of the church is what they see through the Eddie Long situation. That's not the black church. We're not monolithic, clearly. But the thing is, up until a certain point, we would think, as Marvin was saying, churches in their communities have been doing things for years. You would get the impression that the black church is not doing anything in their community, and that's not true. So somehow or another, the word has to be spread that they are, in fact, very sensitive and very, very much in tune to what's going on in their community. But people don't know that. And that's a problem that we have that has to be changed, because the black church, or black churches have been affected. Not the black church, but the church has been affected. But we are still going through kind of a transformation right now, again, because of technology, because of fragmentation. But it is still an important part of black society, and it's probably almost the last bastion in terms of where you can go and where you can get the word and where you get some guidance. Where else do you go? Where else can you go?
But I think we're in an interesting moment in time, without being too political. We always need a galvanizing force to bring people together around various things. And so, in the civil rights movement, the galvanizing thing was that we were working together for economics and jobs, and we were working together to make sure that black people had their civil rights and their human rights recognized. And we didn't have all of the media that can help us now. I think now is the time, and I was really excited about this panel tonight for this reason. If we can find ways to do some positive messaging and learning more about what, quote unquote, the church is supposed to represent, finding those opportunities for churches to share their ministries, finding those opportunities when good things are happening to bring us together around issues. For example, December 7th through the 9th, right here in the city, the Conference of National Black Churches is coming together to talk about how we work together as churches across this nation. The 9 historically African-American denominations will be at the Omni Shore Hotel talking about economics and how to deal with jobs and how to deal with health care. And we need to have you folks there to help get the messaging out. And what does your church do? What does your church community do to help advance the creation of jobs? We have small business people in our churches that don't necessarily get called upon to say how they can help. So there are lots of strategies that we can use. We keep waiting for one voice. And all of us have to be those voices. There is not one single isolated person. The last thing I want to say about this is when you were trying to figure out the word diaconate. That diaconate is the word from which the word deacon comes. It's the Greek word, and it means servant. And so those of us who are called to work in our churches, whether we have the title deaconess or deacon, we are called to serve. And that service has to be defined in the context of what's going on in our communities. So as a pastor, the people in your congregation, you lift up all the time that they're called to work. They're called to touch other people's lives. They're called to live a life that even when we fall down, they can look at somebody else and say, but she's making it anyhow. That's the hope piece that we have to give, even if we don't have it perfect. And to have the media help us to get some of that message out, that there's no one person, no one Martin Luther King, no one Dr. Wamble, no one. Every one of us is a minister in this community if we're called to serve and help other people improve their lives.
One thing I wanted to say about the media is the media the only attention they get is when things go wrong. So Lon is correct that churches all around the country are doing some great things. If you look at the programs, even of the mega church, everybody, I mean, they have a list of all the great things they're doing. No one cares. For our community, we have to go to the black newspapers. I mean, the black newspaper has always served that role for us in terms of the things that were going on in our community. You would never see them in your local newspaper unless you got it at one religious section. It was very, very small, and you got maybe 4 or 5 lines. But if we wanted to find out what was going on in our community, in our churches, it was always the black newspapers that you could go to, and you could find out what's going on. Because they don't care about the good things that we are doing in our community. They don't care. Now, as soon as you do something wrong, it's on CNN. But if you're doing what is good and what is right and what is positive for your community and for your church, you don't hear about it at all. And so I don't want to depend on the media to drive what I do or how I do it, or whether, as long as I'm meeting the needs of my congregation, of my community, I'm fine with that. If the word gets out, that's good. If I write something, somebody writes something in the newspaper and it happens to get in, and it's probably going to be the black newspaper, it's going to be very, very small, that's fine. But I guess the question is there a medium that we can use that is more effective? Because we can't get our stories out. Over and over again in history, the great stories that happened in our community, we can't get the mainstream community, and even with 500 channels now, we still can't get anybody to cover it. We can't get anybody to, and so they don't care. I mean, and there are absolutely great programs. We talk about all the programs that all the churches were involved in. I think we would really be astonished at the great things that churches are doing. But the word's not getting out there, and I'm not really sure it has to, as long as the word.
I mean, on that point, I guess, and Marvin and I very rarely disagree, but we do. And I guess I want to give credit to Denise Rollard because a couple weeks ago, actually down the street, she partnered with CNN to talk about the whole almighty debt, and that program that CNN ran. And what was amazing to me is, I guess, Reverend Sorey was featured and what he was doing in his church. And in a lot of ways, I mean, it was eye-opening to me, and I guess the point is that Marvin and I were involved in a project with Black Methodist churches around this time last year. And I was amazed at the kind of attention, once we started working on trying to get media for this thing, people are interested in what churches are doing. I think because, it's not so much because of, they don't care, whatever, but I think right now, the country is hurting. It's not just us. The economy, the stress, everything that's going on. And so, in large numbers, people, not just blacks, everybody, they're flocking somewhere to find some kind of spiritual uplift because there's a real crisis situation. They call it a recession, it's a depression. And let's not be real about it. And we got the memo that it was over last year. I mean, come on. Anyway, the problem is, I found out that, I was amazed at the interest that news organizations had about about the Black Church and what they were doing. And this was a positive situation. You know, we were the kind of coverage we got on this thing. So folks are interested because the fact is the church, again, is really a magnet for people who are hurting for whatever reason. And it is still the place that people go or want to go. I think one of the things that I found is that there are a lot more non-denominational churches because, as you had indicated, folks are not satisfied with the traditional church and they're not getting the message or it's not being presented in the right way. So folks are going other places. They want some guidance. They want something to help their spirits. And it may not be in the conventional fire and brimstone. It's got to be something else. But there is an interest. There is a desire. It's up to us to try to figure out how we package this and what we do with it. I mean, that's just my thought on that piece.
With everything that we did for the Black Methodists in the national story, it didn't get a tenth of the coverage of any longer. It's nothing. You know, we had denominations nationwide.
There's a saying in the media that if it bleeds, it leads. And I actually had an expert who used to tell me, you know, just put some sex in it. No matter what it is, just put some sex in it, and they'll rate it. It's about ratings, unfortunately, in too many instances. But, you know, I want to say that about 3 years ago, I did a story, you know, on, you know, when the economy began to, you know, go on the slide. I did a story for the NNPA News Service pertaining to what churches around the nation are doing to help their parishioners. I found some incredible stories of what pastors were doing. Some of them, unfortunately, had to lay off huge staffs. Bishop Noel Jones was helping to finance people's businesses. There were some great things going on. But then there's like a yeah, but in the spirit. Because I've also covered stories like this one in Richmond, Virginia, where, well, I won't say his name, a pastor who was the police chaplain at one point. When I used to work at the Richmond Free Press and the Richmond Afro, got caught drunk driving and in possession of cocaine. Now, you know, I have to write that story. So are we in the Black church defeating our purpose if we don't directly address the issue that clearly has shown us that it's not just the parishioners hurting, but the pastors as well? If we don't address that, then are we going to totally lose it? Are we going to cause people to flee and not come to the Black church at all for spiritual or social help?
One of the most difficult things, you'll hear many, many preachers, many pastors say this, one of the hardest parts about preaching is that at some point you have to be willing to share your own story. Share your own shortcomings, share your own needs, share your own pain, and still share the good news. And so it's a difficult balance. On the Sunday morning or the whatever day that you're preaching, that you got to stand before God's people who are hurting, who you feel called to minister to, and yet you're in so much pain yourself. So very often, and I've had many conversations with pastors and preacher friends, that you put your own stuff way back, and you almost have to become theatrical to be able to share the message of the good news and not cry all over the people on your own stuff. And yet there are times that the Holy Spirit will convict you. And I've had this happen in my own preaching where it's not in my text, it's not in my manuscript, but the Lord will require me to speak some of my own stuff. And those are the times, most often, that I've had people come to me later privately and say, Reverend Brenda, when you talked about this, I realized that I'm not the only person that's happening to. You really helped me today. Well, I can't do that every time I get up to preach. And I don't have to do it every Sunday. But there is something in that, in that ministry moment, that every once in a while you have to know that your leader is human, that he or she bleeds and cries and suffers and has pain, and they can't do it every time they get up to preach. But if you're under the teaching of a person, then you see all of those sides of that person, and they have to be willing to go there sometimes. I try to stop using the language, I'm going to church. And I say I'm going to worship. Because that's where I'm just going to get refueled for the work of ministry. To be able to go out and continue to do whatever I've been assigned to do with the rest of my time. So we have to give pastors, preachers that opportunity, the freedom to sometimes be weak. And not kick them out for it. Just, to be able to tell the truth.
In a moment, I'm sorry.
No, I would say, for me, my goal is always to be as transparent as possible. Because to me, that is the good news.
And you're right.
The good news is where, is where he brought me from.
Amen.
The things that I used to do, I don't do them anymore. And so I can look at someone in the eyes and say, yeah, I've been there, I've done that, I understand you, I've been there, but he brought me out of that. And he can bring you out of that too. I mean, I want to be transparent. I want you to know.
What if you're there though? What if it's not that's where he brought you from and I'm already there? What if you're there?
If I'm right there,
Yeah.
I got hope because he has brought me from. It's the same God who brought me to where I am right now. It's going to get me out of this.
So is that to say that Bishop Eddie Long should have just, if guilty, should he or any other pastor just get up on Sunday morning and confess their faults to one another? Or what should they do?
I mean, I can't say what Brenda Long should have done.
Well,
I can't step into his shoes because what happened was a result of long time stuff. He didn't just start that and then he got caught. So this was a long time that he had to be wrestling with that. And you can bet that he was, the Holy Spirit and him were having a tangle with that for a very, very long time. And the thing is that at some point, you have to stop and ask for forgiveness. And the word says that if you are faithful and just and ask for forgiveness, he will forgive you. And so I think that at some point, you have to do that at some point. And things just got out of hand before he could do that, and whether he chose to do that or not.
Okay, we're going to be taking questions from the audience in just a moment. I want to ask this final question before we go there. There is a book, Your Pastor, An Endangered Species, that was actually published 14 years ago, June 1996. And it uses statistics gathered by an expert named George Barner, church statistics. Dr. Barner reports that 1,500 pastors leave the ministry each month. If present trends continue with these pastors, and I think these are black and white pastors, leaving the church each month, where will the church be in the next 20 years? In other words, where do we go from here? This is getting to the part that I really want us to just get to is what happens now? What is your vision for how to heal this thing so that if the black church is in fact losing its grip, we can get it back? How we get the grip back? How we get our grip back? The black church.
Well, I'd start with the education piece so that even in our seminaries, and we are seeing more and more people getting professional training and preparation for ministry. It's not to say that you can't be called and do the ministry without it, but more and more the expectation now is that we are training our leaders. I heard you say you're minister in training. It is deep work.
True.
And part of that training, we're requiring psychological evaluations. We're requiring people to know that counseling for themselves as well as for the folk they're going to be in relationship with is an important part. Learning to understand and know who you are so that as we recruit people for seminary training, we're also helping them to have a higher level of knowledge of what's expected of them. That you were trained to be a doctor, you were trained to be an astronaut, there's a level of expectation so that our congregations can expect that people are coming in with a greater level of professional skill in addition to the anointing, and I'm not minimizing that at all, but recognizing that you've got to equip people to help them understand what they're coming into, so that the burnout, the fear when they get into ministry doesn't drive them out so quickly. So part of that is exposing them to training and a greater awareness of what it means to go into ministry as a profession.
Okay, equipping people
Yes.
for the ministry outside of the Holy Spirit, giving the people tools that they'll need, counseling, etc. What else? Where else do we go from here?
I mean, if you have decided, you have been called, and this is where you want to go, I have several mentors who work with me and who talk with me and who tell me the real deal about this thing. I mean, you see a minister on Sunday, everything looks so good. They're in that fancy robe and the lights are bright. But this is a very difficult profession. The stats that you read verify that. But if I know what I'm getting into, if I know the challenges that I'm going to face, if I know the battles that I have to go up against, and then I also know that there is help, then I am better prepared than going in with rose-colored glasses and thinking that everything is going to be great because I'm called by God. So I think it is the realities of what this call really is. Facing those and really getting not only your mentor, but getting people around you who that you can talk to openly and honestly about this thing, so that at least it's out there. But there's so many times, you are very, very confused about what this calling really is, and the difficulties of it. Because, like you said, you're hurting and people are pouring their hurts on you. These things come. You have to be able to really be prepared to handle that. And if you can't handle that, know where you can go. I make calls. I have my mentors on speed dial. because I need, I'm going to pray. I need help. I need help every day. I need help. And so if you understand that, and you understand it's okay to need help.
Yeah.
It's okay to get assistance. It's okay to call somebody and say, look, I'm about done here. It's okay. It's okay. So I just think that understanding the realities, not the TV sweet story, but the realities of what you get into. I think that will be helpful.
Okay. Having wise mentors
Yeah.
to help to train you up. Lon, you have any other ideas? So where we go from here?
Well, I think that, when you have people like Dr. Mitchell and with Marvin, Reverend Wamble, and I've known Marvin for go back a long way. but I think the thing is that, again, it kind of goes to the whole piece of being state of the art. I think the thing is in understanding society, understanding the technologies, and understanding the environment. Like I say, you can preach, you can give spiritual guidance, but understanding the environment in which we live now, that the technologies and all the things that are available at your disposal, to use that, because we've got a rapid, the kids now in high school and college now are even more computer and mobile media savvy than we are. And so going and using those kind of mechanisms. And I got to say, the one thing, and Marvin will love this, but I think the last year or so for me to see the things that have happened to me and to others, that and it sounds a little strange, but I'm not of the calling of them, but you see things like Michael Vick, Tiger Woods, Eddie Long. You'll be there soon. But when you see those things happen, I mean, it's really that's a work and act of God. That's a wake up call to folks. We've all had it at some point in time, and maybe when I was younger, I may not have really kind of thought about that and realized that, but that's exactly, and we saw, I guess, an exhibition of what that was on Monday if you're a football fan, in terms of what redemption looks like, what happened. Of course, we went to Washington. But the thing is that, and I've seen this, and I've experienced it, and I've seen it, and really, I mean, after a while you sit back and realize there is a God, there is a spirit. We all need to kind of come to grips with that, and how we accept it, how we are able to communicate and maybe spread that word and do what we do in order for that to be something that we all can kind of benefit from.
I just want to add one other piece about the training piece that in our churches, and most of our churches are perhaps doing this now, we talk about equipping our leaders, but we also have to equip the people within our churches. So you talk about ministry training, we're talking about leadership development for the folks who are called into the various ministries at the church, whether you're working with the children, you're in the Sunday school, whatever your ministry assignment is in church, there's some leadership training that goes with that. So, we have people, a lot of churches have what they call the nurses unit. And it can be a powerful place for people to be, but it's the only place you can be a nurse just by putting on a uniform. That's white. So we need to make sure that we're equipping people in those roles within the church as well. We strengthen the whole body when we give people more effective tools to do whatever it is they're called to do. And to help people learn how to deal with conflict. Just like in your family, you're just not supposed to quit when you get mad at mom and daddy, get mad at the preacher. You find a way to bring people together to have conversation and reconcile around the differences.
Excellent. Before we go to you, wonderful audience to ask questions, I just want to give my take on that question about where we go from here. I'm a big fan of Bishop T.D. Jakes. I understand he's a mega minister, I know, but he has an incredible vision and anointing from God. And a few years ago, he held what he called a leading while leading conference, in which he invited pastors and church leaders from around the country to do exactly what Marvin Wamble spoke to, and that is to be transparent. And they came to the altar. They confessed they were in pain. And one of the things that Bishop Jakes says that I agree with him is there is absolutely a need for a place, a safe haven for pastors to go to when they get tired. Pastors need to rest. That's one of the things. Y'all preaching all the time, and you're not resting. And so they need to rest, and they need to go to a place where they can rest with their husbands, their wives, get counseling, etc., and then go back refreshed and continue to preach the gospel, because there will be Davids all over the place. And what did God do? He restored him to the kingship. Come on, amen. So let's go to the audience. You have questions for the distinguished panel? Anything you want to say?
Well, I have a question. This is
Derek, and we'll get to the back.
Good.
No, please.
My question to you all is, one of the key things is that we have, the church is filled with black women, 70%, 60%, with very little black men. Why is that?
I don't want you to answer that, but he can probably answer. That's my question.
I have a heart for men in the church. And a lot of the problem, there's a whole lot of problems, especially, when I see a man on Sunday morning drive up to the church and drop his wife off and then he goes back home. It's like, what's up with that? But there's a lot of difficulty with the other men. And so a lot of them are like, why are you going up there to see that man? I don't want to listen to that man, another man who's in the life. There's a great book called Why Men Don't Go to Church. And it gives a plethora of different reasons about why men don't go to church. But if as a man I've never seen anyone in my family go to church, and we're approaching the first generation really that nobody's church. Before, everybody, grandma, somebody woke you up and took you now. So we're this first generation where nobody went to church except for mom. And so I don't really know, I've never even seen a lot of men go to church. And when you get to church, this is one of the things from the book, when you get to church, church looks like a place that women designed. Everything is done by women. And as a pastor with a PR training, I have to preach to my audience. And my audience is 70% women. So what's the message slant going to be? Toward women. So am I alienating men who are there? So I'm not preaching a word for the men who might want to come in, who see all the women who are in charge and don't see any openings to do anything except for the trustee board and maybe be an usher. And so the inclusiveness, and this began happening, I believe it was in World War II when the men went to war and there was more women. When the men came back, there was no place for them in the church, so they just stayed home. They just stayed home. So the solution is to be very, very cognizant. I have a men's fellowship where I bring men in separate. No women there so we can talk. So we can be transparent without the women because there's issues that men go through, spiritual issues that men go through that they're not going to discuss with a woman sitting there. And so you have to be very, very cognizant of how men feel and begin. I have a men's day and we redesign the church. We make it look like we put up swords and shields. Man, we're going warrior on you. You know what I'm saying? Because that's what men want to do.
Think about that.
You know? I mean, so you have to understand there's a great difference. And the men have picked up on it, and they're not real comfortable there. So what do you have to do in order to make men of your community comfortable? And then get them in that type of a setting, and you can talk. We can talk. Because, hey, brothers is hurting. Brothers are hurting, man. And they need to talk, and they need to be open, and they need to know that Jesus is the answer.
I think, to that question, it's unfortunate, but it's larger than the church. I think many of you are probably familiar, I think about a week or so ago, 2 weeks ago, NBC, the piece about black males, especially in school, and how far behind we are. And there's not a day that doesn't go by. We see our county officials, we see our ministers, we see our boxing coaches all being arrested, whatever, every day. So it's almost, when I was younger, I never thought about that, but it's almost like there's a conspiracy going beyond the church in terms of where black men are and why we're not there and what's happening to us. So it's, even in college, you go to Howard University classroom, it's 90% women. Where the brothers at? So it goes even larger than the church. I think the church is a place that now, as you talked about, they're trying to address it, and it needs to be addressed in other places as well. But there's a bigger problem than this church right now.
I was in Baltimore a few weeks ago ministering at a women's conference, and there were 2 men in the room. One was the pastor, and one was a husband of one of the women. And after the day-long conference was over, the friend of the pastor walked up to me in Prideville, and he said, "You talked about abortion." And he said, "But you talked about it from the standpoint of what women go through. What about what a man goes through when that happens, or when he insists on a girlfriend or a wife having an abortion?" And he said that he was going to have a men's conference coming up in which that issue was going to be addressed. I said that to say that there are apparently issues that we assume pertain specifically to women, and perhaps we're not addressing the issues of the men. I'll just leave that right there. Questions from the audience?
Sorry to interject here. Can I just comment about this? Because I'm an associate pastor at a church here in Southeast DC, and my bishop always says that we're probably the only church, the only place in DC where black men run, but they're not running from the police. They're running from Jesus. More than half our church are men. And I think that part of that is what draws them to the church. And the pastor here spoke that you have to be creative in terms of the things that you do to open the door for men. Our bishop plays basketball. Every other Saturday they do a basketball outreach thing in the community. Every Saturday they have their own men-to-men conversations where the men can be real. But at the end of the day, I think that there is so many people, so many men who, especially when you talk about men that are transitioning from prison, reentry situations of recidivism, there are plenty of men that are running to the church. The question is, does the church have the human capital and the ability in terms of what they can offer to keep the men there? The men want to learn how to be better men, to be better fathers. But unfortunately, and more often than not, there are not enough programs within the church to keep the interest and engagement of the men. And so I say that, you know, when you have CDCs or community development corporations, if you will, that are within your churches that are doing outreach such as ours, we have a men's transitional home, we have a men's ministry, there's so many different ministries. And it's all about the programs that are available within those churches, whether it's mega or whether it's mini. It's all about the outreach and the ministry.
But there has to be a desire too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, there has to be a desire. You have to be a desire to want that. You know, and they can feel if you want them or if you don't. They can feel.
Many of them want leadership.
Yeah, they do.
That's absolutely amazing. She said half of the congregation are men. Let's just applaud that.
As the minister of stewardship and missions at Metropolitan Baptist Church, it's a blessing and a curse now that we have a website and that everybody has my email address. I used to get stopped a lot on Sunday with questions about tithing and all, and now I get a lot of emails. But the good news is, because it's my ministry, I do know how to talk to people about the reasons for giving and how you discern what God wants you to do and the purpose of tithing. And it saves me a lot of time to be able to do it online. And then people who I've responded to online will often then identify themselves to me in subsequent meetings at the church. But people are uncomfortable generally talking about money, period. You know I'm telling you. So it has helped me in my ministry of stewardship. So the people who are uncomfortable talking about money face to face ask me, and I'm not afraid of sharing an answer with them. It's scripture-based, and it's based on the program ministries of our church.
Well, there, you are in the perfect position to answer those questions. It should be. I would rather you do it than me. In reality, because they're looking at me as he's the high and mighty. He's the pastor. He has to tithe. He has to do this. But God has blessed you, and God has put you in that position so that you can tell them, man to man, woman to woman, person to person, of how it has changed your life and what it has done for you. That's your testimony. I say this more than anything else I say in the church about our experience. We worked. I worked with Lon in public relations. In public relations, and we worked with the United States Army. In the middle of the war in Iraq, when people were getting killed all over them, you remember the Washington Post used to have that page where all the, you're like, no. And yet we worked with the recruiters. And I said, how can you get anybody to join the Army? And all this stuff going on. And he said, I just tell them my story. I tell them for who I was when I came into the Army, how the Army has changed me, and now I'm new, and I am in the position now because of my story. And so that's all you have to do, is tell them your story. And that's for everything. I tell people in my church that you don't have to think of anything high. Tell them what God did for you, why you are where you are, why you tithe, what tithing has done for you. Because for me, I'm supposed to do it. People out like they have their options out there. And so when people tell the real story, that's this whole transparency thing we were talking about. When people can tell the real story, it's like, wow, you tithe and you're not broke all the time. Then they can identify with that. So yeah, I get the questions, but I'll send them to somebody. Talk to Sister So and So. She tithes. Tell them, see how they make it, because that's the real deal right there.
And even as I ditto that, having been the chair of the Board of Trustees for 9 years, most of the time that's not the story folk are asking. The people who have the nervousness about asking, they're not asking the spiritual story. They're asking, what is the church doing with my money? And that's a different, so when we get real, that's what they want to know. And so the churches are not willing to be transparent with the books and do audited accounts. That makes people even more reluctant to sow into it because they're thinking of it on less of the spiritual realm than on the business side. And part of what the church looks at is the business side.
The pastor drives up with the new car, they really want to know that.
There's been another question right there, Ronnie, on that point. There's been a record number of foreclosures across the nation of churches, black churches, having foreclosed upon
church is hurting.
I think it was Lon said earlier that when the nation is in a recession, black folks are in a depression for sure. And part of the transparency of the preaching and teaching ministry is to show how that relationship, that we don't escape that as the body of Christ. And helping people to understand that, I mean, if you're in my congregation and you're hurting and we're all hurting together, the impact is going to be felt in many, many ways. But we still press forward. We do all we can on our own to cut expenses, to do extra things, to bring in revenue. But it's real that this economic crisis has left no segment of our society untouched. And as churches come through these crises, there's going to be another hallelujah story. But we do have to be transparent about what we're doing and how we don't escape this. This wasn't just, churches weren't carved out and say, you're not going to feel this recession, this depression. Tell the story and be honest about it.
Other questions from the audience?
I have a question as it relates to image and politics. I feel that we talk about there not being a voice in the Black church, and I feel that the church does not deal with the polarizing issues in our community. What part do you think politics plays in their image being out there and being careful? Okay, my palms are being greased, my church is mega because I got somebody protecting me. So what part does that play?
Well, I think one of the things that well, okay, I'm back on this conspiracy piece. I'm sorry to bring that up, but I think with Long, especially, I mean, what happens or what's happening with him is detrimental to black folks in the sense that what's left in terms of the bastion of the black community is the church. And when you start to unravel that, and your public officials as well, but especially the church, then you're starting to really kind of take out the underpinnings of black society. And so I think that, sure, it's supposed to be a separation of church and state, but I mean, it's real that, every Sunday, politicians make a point to come to a church to at least be seen and to talk to folks. And I think that, we're going again we're going in a crossroads. And I think that what we're seeing now is just a really, as was said earlier, a tip of the iceberg. There's going to be more issues coming out, more problems, and more situations. And I think, to Marvin's point, I guess in terms of being strong about this, I guess you're really dealing with your following, to be clear and be transparent. I think that's the thing, like, it's a good business, good policy, good ministering is what you really going to need to have to do. So that's just my feeling on that. But there's going to be more of this. I think that we are kind of at a crossroads. We've got a very conservative Congress about to take over, and who knows what's going to happen with that. I mean, I hate to say that, but that's the reality.
Other questions?
Yeah, I'm lost, but anyway, maybe I'll be found. But, well, one thing I'm going to say was when Reverend Wamble, I have to get used to that, talked about tithing. And you said this is something I'm supposed to do, and that's because why? Who are you that this is something that you're supposed to do?
It's biblically based that is what you are called to do as a Christian, is to give 10%.
No, you're supposed to. He's not supposed to. You just said, I'm supposed to.
The point was, I'm supposed to, he's supposed to too, but I am, as the leader, I can't ask them to do anything that, as a leader, that I'm not willing to do. So that was that.
So that's I think that's one of the things where we started off, I guess, Hazel, talking about, what those who are at the head of the church, if there's this expectation that those at the head of the church have some greater responsibility to uphold whatever, right? I mean, I've been asking questions now why pastors don't wear robes anymore. I mean, they replace the robes now with the suits. But anyway, that's a whole other issue. But the church doesn't, I think it's not really, as opposed to church, I'm looking at crises, and that the Catholic Church, to me, is in a greater crisis is going to forever have these crises. And that people are gonna go and they're not gonna go. You know, I just think that, so we have this conversation as if, you know, the church is gonna crumble or whatever. I don't think that's gonna happen because, and then of course you talk about what's church. Where two or more are gathered in my name, you know, if I'm at home with my whatever, you know, and looking at church on television, you know, am I in church? If I'm watching somebody preach on television, am I in church? Is that church?
Is it?
Is it church?
Well, I would say you're having a worship experience.
Okay.
But part again of the definition of church, if we're in fellowship with one another, and the Bible calls us to be in communion with the saints, it calls us to build community. And so you can have a worship experience, but are you obeying the mandate to be in fellowship, not to forsake the fellowship of the saints? Are you building community? Are you working with others to serve and share the good news? And that's all of our responsibility. One of the things that being in that community will do, as you have somebody that's helping to instruct you in the Word, help you to rightly divide the Word of truth, to study and to be in agreement with, is that then when you have these worship experiences outside, they're richer for you. And you have a better way of interpreting how to apply that Word to your own life. And that's why I think the educational part of our church is really, really so critical.
Last Sunday I went to the church that occupies the space that Metropolitan used to, Unity. And it was really interesting to hear the language, the words they use and the words they don't use. And, you know, I don't know what I'm really saying here other than we were brought here together, I guess, because of this Eddie Long situation. And this is in court. Is this in court?
I think they're still probably negotiating, because it's all civil, and right now you got suits, so I think what's going on, that's why it's been so quiet, that they're probably trying to negotiate behind the scenes. Right?
So I think almost that's where the news value comes. That's where where people do things that are where other systems can get involved. The judiciary system, the tax system, whatever you're doing that's not religious per se, is where other folks get involved in your business, and you're not obeying, you know, this what's the word that you use for people who are, what's the word? Can't think of it. You know, when it's not religious, it's
Secular.
secular. Thank you. I'm at that age now, we have to go. But in the secular sense, when things are secular, that seems to be where the big news comes in. You know, like the guy who was in HBO did the piece on the minister out in Colorado,
Right.
who was actually put out of the state. He was put out of the state because he was having a relationship with a homosexual relationship. You know, so I mean these things happen, right? They just happen, and I think it was good the way we all started with just the fact that there's you know, you make a mistake, you're forgiven for it. But when you hold yourself to a higher standard, and you tell the congregation, I have to tithe, you're supposed to, but I have to. That's when people start looking at you as someone other than a human being. You know, to me, that's I mean, the rest of us. To me, it's like, okay, you create this expectation from your congregation, you are someone over and above who we are. You should strive to be like me because I'm more godlike, and it's my duty to be more godlike, as opposed to all of us having to be like that.
Well, no, I mean I definitely don't feel that way. But people, because I was a sports writer, I got to do a sports analogy. as a leader of the team, if I don't run wind sprints, other people feel they don't have to do that. So as a leader, you have to take a leadership position. That's all I'm saying. And so I have to lead the way. I have been called to lead the way. And so I want them to see as a leader what I do. I'm not trying to set myself up higher, but I have been called to lead.
But you're setting yourself up.
I may be, but I know God put me there. So it has nothing to do with me. I've been called to that. And in that position, in the Army, when we deal with generals, generals have certain responsibilities because of their position and what they've been called to do than the other men have.
That's secular, that's military.
But that's military, that's secular, but it's all, in terms of this battle that we're going through, I'm giving you examples. It's all, leadership is leadership. And so if as a leader, I feel there's certain things I have to do, because if I don't do them, then those who are following me won't do them.
And it's in the context of what you're teaching overall. We say in our call to giving, we're a tithing church. This is just what we teach at our church. We're a tithing church because the Word of God teaches tithing. Our experience gives witness to tithing, the things we've been through in our lives. And our obedience to God requires tithing. Now let us bring our tithes and offerings to the Lord. And we're basing that on lots of scripture, but in particular on the Malachi portion. So you've got to teach it, you've got to reinforce it, and then when you explain why tithing in biblical sense is the basis for how we get the resources to do ministry. So that we don't have to, in our church we teach that it keeps us from having to sell chicken dinners and do little things that are picking at people all the time. But it's the biblically based way to get the finances to run the church. And it does take money to run the physical being of having the church and having staff and having light bills to pay. I mean, those are practical parts of keeping ministries going.
And everyone's called to tithe. Everybody's called to tithe.
And I think that's
Everybody's responsible.
When you say it is because of who I am, and I understand how it works, but it's because of who I am that I am held to a higher standard. Right? I'm held to a higher standard, recognizing that you are like me, right? And so it's not that we're all held to a higher standard. We are all held to a higher standard. And if we are all sinners that are trying to get there, then you just happen to have a title, which is pastor. Mine is parishioner. Both P's. I'm sitting in the pew, you're in the pulpit, so it's double P, or quadruple P's. But we're both the same, striving to do better. But if you say, I am here. When Eddie Long, everybody else, some guy right now is out there molesting some kids, right? Or a woman, right now. But they're not holding themselves to any higher standard. But they know they're wrong. They know they're wrong. And if they get caught, they're going to go to jail, right? But, I don't know, I guess it just seems as though the pressure that's put on a pastor, that you put on yourself, which separates you from the rest of us, means that we can point at you when you do wrong. And we should know that may happen. It just may happen.
And so we go back to that.
We know it does happen, and then you forgive. We do forgive.
Exactly. We go back to that same question. What happens when it does happen? When you fail to tithe or to walk holy and upright before God. We're going to close out with this last question.
Okay. Well, in my readings and in hearing very senior Black religious leaders and scholars speak, they have a cliche that they like to say that the Black church doesn't separate the sacred from the profane. And that goes against the priestly world order that God established in the law. And then in the gospel, Jesus says, cast not your pearls before swine, do not give what's holy to what's unclean. What I've experienced in the Black church, I am in ministry, been in ministry for 15 years, and I have experienced all manner of malfeasance. I've seen the bowels of the church, I've experienced some really horrible things, and I've seen a system of enabling where you have leaders in the church, and whenever you find a corrupt leader, you usually got dozens of people surrounding them, creating the system and the atmosphere for them to execute their behavior. And I found that extremely troubling. And when I got to the point where, I just stopped going to church for a while. And when I knew what I needed to do to come back, I had to come back to Jesus. And it didn't matter whether the context was black, white, or whatever. I had to go somewhere that was being the light of the world. And I think that the Black church has contaminated itself in concealing so much that we know that's going on and not living up to what God has called the church to be, that it has discredited itself in a lot of respects. It still does some good things, but the world knows what's going on behind the doors of the church, and it's not cool, and that makes it very unattractive to people. You know, if you're going to get hustled, you might as well get hustled on the street. If you're going to get abused, why go inside where you're supposed to be safe to have those things happen to you? And so I think God is mad. I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think God is purging the institution of the church, the Catholic Church, the Black church, the whoever church. Because God will not be mocked, and a lot of things that are being done in God's name really blasphemes the Holy Spirit. And one of the things that really gets me, and I don't think I have a question, is that I'm going to wrap it up, but one of the things that gets me is that you have this group of, parishioners who sit out there, and those who are not actively enabling are not adequately equipping themselves and availing themselves of the power and authority that the Holy Spirit provides to everybody to stand up for what's going on, what's right, and what's God's real order and purpose for the church is. And like I said, and it doesn't have to be black, because in the end, we're all supposed to be unified. So we should be trying to work the Black church out of business in fellowship with our brothers and sisters who are not black. Because Jesus ain't coming back for a black church or a white church or other church. He's coming back for one church without spot or wrinkle. And that's what we need to prepare ourselves for.
Well, a quick response. One of the things that's not mentioned in my bio is that I have started a racial reconciliation ministry. We meet every Friday night, 6:30, 7:30, trying to figure out how to do reconciliation as the church. And it's almost cliche-ish, but even with all the pain that you experience, again, how we conceive what the church is supposed to be. The church is not a place of comfort. It is a hospital for folk who are broken and sick. And even our leaders are broken and sick. And we come to that place hoping for the healing power, the transforming power of the Spirit to move us to a different place. So I'm sorry for what you've gone through. The church is one of the best places in the world to go to be heard. But it's also the place you can go to be healed and to grow and know that God is still there.
Okay. As we close out, I've always been told that the 4 pillars that hold up the Black community are the Black educational institutions, the Black businesses, the Black press, and yes, the Black church. So as we have come together tonight to discuss whether the Black church is losing its grip, we better pray that it doesn't, because something is going to fall. Our community is going to be lopsided if it's not already. And so this panel tonight has articulated some of the answers to propping it back up, equipping people educationally to lead in ministry, having mentors for pastors, making sure that pastors have wise ones to go to, and those ones will not judge them when they fall. Transparency, being open and honest about what your failures are, and what your hurts are, and what your brokennesses are. Rest and healing, and actual ministry to pastors in a safe haven. And so thank you very much. I'm going to take this commercial break and opportunity to invite you tomorrow night to the launch of Trice Edney Wire at the National Press Club. This is going to be a good old time. It's going to be music and fellowship and food and it's something that God has done in my life. And so I invite you to the National Press Club from 6 to 8:30. Thank you very much.
I just want to thank everybody for coming up. This has been a wonderful conversation. My mind has been working for, I see this could be actually a series of several conversations that we can have. We just barely touched the surface of a number of topics discussed. And I thank all our three esteemed guests. And Hazel, you did an excellent job. Thank you so much. I neglected to introduce myself. I'm Nairi Wright. I'm president of the Capitol Press Club. My board here, Joan, our treasurer, Marvin Wamble, our first vice president, and everybody there. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. We put some flyers on your chair for our joint holiday party that will be coming up with WABJ and Beavers.